Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about M.J. Kaufman's play Sagittarius Ponderosa, which I'm reading out of the Methuen Drama Book of Trans Plays. Highly recommended. So Sagittarius Ponderosa is set in the Pacific Northwest, where Kaufman is from, actually. It tells the story of Archer, who has returned home because of his father's medical problems from someplace else. We don't really know. I would maybe speculate Brooklyn, because I think that's where Kaufman lives. But it's not clear from the play, and it's really not that important. So Archer has come home. Archer is not out to his parents, who still know him as Angela, or Angie. Archer's grandmother, who's very, very old and deaf, is convinced that Angela is soon going to meet a nice man and get married. And this is an interesting thing in the play, I think, because throughout much of the play, it's a source of sort of discomfort for everybody, because so I think this is one of the interesting things. There's a lot of interesting things. There's a lot of layers here, and so I'm having trouble talking about it linearly. We know, of course, that Archer is trans, that it's not Angela, it's Archer. Grandma doesn't know. And throughout much of the play, Grandma's sort of insistence that Angela is going to get married soon is an uncomfortable thing. But there's a point where... Let's see if I marked this. I think I did. Possibly not. I should have marked it if I didn't. Yes. So there's this point where Grandma is sitting on her sofa with her friend Peterson, who's played by a puppet, operated by the actor who plays Pops. And they share a copy of the New York Times. They read it together. It's a kind of adorable courting ritual kind of thing. And Grandma wants to look at the wedding announcements. So she says, "Look at all those young people getting married, all those families getting bigger. Someone gets another father, another mother, another child, so much to celebrate. My family just gets smaller." And Peterson says, "Diana told me your son died." That's Pops, by the way. Pops passes away in this play. And Grandma says, "Yes, my granddaughter's single." They can't hear very well, so that they talk past one another. But that idea, like that, wow, that was such a great twist, I thought, that Grandma is not just deluding herself about Archer being cisgender, Archer still being female, Archer getting married, etc., 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 etc. It is this profound sense of loss that Grandma has, that her family diminishes. Her son has just died. Her grandson, her trans grandson, is probably not that keen on getting married, although Archer doesn't sort of register sort of formal opposition. He ducks the issue every time Grandma brings it up. But that sort of profound sense of loss actually really recontextualized Grandma's character for me. So I thought that was a brilliant move on Kaufman's part. While all of that is going on, Archer is uneasy around his family because, again, they don't know that he's trans. They don't know his real gender, his real name, etc., etc. And this kind of gets very interesting, because at one point, Pops, who is sick with an unspecified illness, but something that prevents him from eating sugar, so possibly like severe type 2 diabetes, maybe. But Pops decides that he wants to take a new name, because he says that his doctor has sort of recommended this. He says, my doctor suggested I take a new name because he's Jewish, and it's something that Jews do when they're very sick. Because supposedly if you take a new name, the angel of death won't be able to find you. And anyway, he said it might be meaningful for me, and I think it would be. And I just had a dream, so I'm going to do it. So Pop takes the name, he goes from just being named Robert to being named Robert Jason. And he wants people to call him Robert Jason. And so there's this sort of ceremony that he undergoes. He creates his own ceremony for taking this new name. And it's a nice ceremony. He brings his family together. He sort of explains why he still likes and maintains the name Robert or Bob, but also why he's adding the name Jason to it. And then he asks each of his family members to refer to him as Robert Jason, or Bob Jason, as Archer calls him. And then shortly after that, in the next scene, which occurs that same evening, we get this bit of dialogue. So Archer is preparing to go out. He's been meeting this guy named Owen under the large Ponderosa tree. I'm going to talk about that in just a second. But Pop says, Angela, do you still want to be called that? Archer says, huh? Pop says, never mind. Archer says, no, what? Pop says, just seems, I don't know, did you want a different nickname or something? Archer says, where'd you get that idea? Pop says, nowhere. I mean, I just changed my name, so why not you? Never mind. You remember the recycling. Okay, Alex Weaver. She asked me because she saw something on Facebook. So, Pops seems to know that Archer is not Angela, but he doesn't necessarily know what to make of that. He doesn't necessarily know how to approach that. And then, I think another of the ironies of this play is that Mom also seems to know. Mom and Archer do not get along, especially after Pops dies. There's a lot of friction between them. But Mom says, maybe tomorrow you could take the hearing aid and have a talk. This is take Grandma's hearing aid over to her because she can't hear anything and it's irritating everybody. You should probably set her straight about everything. Archer says, what do you mean, everything? Mom says, she just shouldn't get her hopes up. Archer says, about what? Mom says, about, you know. Archer says, what's that supposed to mean? Mom says, do you think you could take Grandma her hearing aid tomorrow? So, and they extricate themselves from that conversation. But it does seem like Mom knows as well that Archer is not Angela, that Archer is trans, that Archer is not going to marry and have kids the way that Grandma wants. But she also doesn't know how to broach that subject. And Archer doesn't know how to address that with either parent either. So the difficulty of coming out is here compounded with parents who I think would be supportive, but who don't know how to be supportive without Archer sort of helping them figure this out. So I think that's a really interesting dilemma. And then at the end of the play, almost end of the play, second to last scene, we actually have a repeat of an earlier conversation. So Pops has already died, but Archer has this kind of vision of Pops in which um, Pops repeats dialogue he had given earlier in the play, but instead of Archer sort of denying his identity, when Pop says, "Do you still want to be called that?" Archer says, "I don't want to be called that. I don't." So we get this turn, and again, because Pops is there's this sort of repetition compulsion to this vision. Pops's dialogue is virtually all the same, with one exception: the last line. Whereas originally, let me find Pops's closing line from there. Whereas originally Pops's last line was, "Just go take Grandma home." Here, we get the additional line, "Good night, Archer. Happy birthday." So I think I think it's beautiful. The other big component of this play that's a sort of important thematic component is a large Ponderosa pine tree, which is where Archer and Owen meet, and they have a fairly brief love affair. Owen is a student. He's studying. I don't know. I forget exactly what he's studying. He works in the Nature Conservancy, and probably like forest management or something like that. And they establish early in the play. Kaufman establishes early in the play that this is the biggest tree in the forest. It represents this sort of colossal ancient solidity, 400 years old by the Forest Conservancy's estimate. So this introduces a sort of interesting element of time into the play, right? Because human lives are comparatively short next to the life of a ponderosa pine. I mean, 400 years old, and it's still growing. It's not even done growing yet. And so there's this symbol of solidity and stability that's visible on stage the entire play. But it's also important. It's also important that this tree and the forest more broadly is threatened by the systems of power that also push Archer to remain closeted to his family. In particular, settler colonialism and capitalism. And in this case, in Archer's case, these forces are patriarchy and heteronormativity, cisnormativity. But those things are deeply intertwined in contemporary U.S. society. So Archer, after Pops dies, Archer goes out to see Owen, and basically Archer just needs emotional support. And so he says, anything at all, just talk about this tree. And Owen explains that the tree was the Ponderosa pine was named for a Scottish guy who discovered it. This was the first guy who sort of cataloged it in the Western sense of cataloging flora, fauna, etc., etc. And so he named it after himself, basically. But what Owen talks about is how this tree and these types of trees traditionally had been basically wildfire proof because their bark is incredibly thick. And traditionally the woodlands were fairly bare of like smaller scale trees and things like that, partially because of indigenous controlled burning techniques. But when the indigenous people were driven off of the land, and when settler colonialists came, that controlled burning stopped. And so there's much more dense underbrush and things like this. And so if that is set ablaze in a wildfire, it's no longer clear that this tree that has stood for 400 years would be able to withstand the heat of those fires. And so there is this profound destructive possibility embodied by the tree. And I think it's a good sort of thematic alignment with the challenges of cisnormativity, heteronormativity, patriarchy, that limit people's ability to survive.